Now let's start things off with My Prague, where Ian Willoughby meets up with documentary filmmaker Keith Jones, who showed Ian his favorite places in the Letná neighbourhood.
Right now we are sitting in front of Bio-Oko, one of the great examples of the remaining Art Deco movie palaces in Prague.
I'm having a mid-afternoon drink outside the Oko Art House Cinema with documentary maker Keith Jones, who's showing me around Letná, the neighbourhood he calls home. The Irish-American, whose most recent work was the well-received Punk in Africa, studied at Prague's FAMU film school and has been living in the city for almost all of the last 22 years. So I asked Keith Jones, what sort of area is Letná?
Letná is, for the most part, like a village, but it also has the character of an island, because it's not only in the strange bend in the river physically in terms of the layout of the city, but it also has a massive park on either side of it. So we live in this area very cut off from the rest of the city in a way, but also very close to it. We can walk into the center, for example, in about 15 minutes. But when you come home in the evening or when you stay in this neighborhood, you really do feel that you're on an island that has a character entirely of its own. Also, the neighborhood has architecturally a very strong unity to it because it's mostly an Art Nouveau and functionalist neighborhood, as you can see around us. And that also gives the place not only a charm, but a sense of its own history. It really roots the place in the modern cultural history of Prague in the last 120 years, let's say. Because most of us who live here live in flats that date to that era, and so we're surrounded by the atmosphere of the early 20th century all the time.
Also, isn't there an art school here? I know a lot of the streets also have names like Keramická, Ceramic Street.
Yeah, certainly. One of the defining characteristics of this neighborhood is the predominance of art students, obviously, and former art students, and also artists or people who work in the field of culture, such as myself. And a lot of that stems from the fact that AVU, the Fine Arts Academy of the Czech Republic, is based here. It also stems from that Art Nouveau era. Also, Výstaviště, the Art Nouveau fairgrounds from the World's Fair of 1891, is here, and Veletržní palác, which is now the Museum of Contemporary and Modern Art of the National Gallery.
Also, it must be far and away the greenest area relatively near to the centre of Prague.
Well, the fact that the neighborhood is essentially a small residential neighborhood of these Art Nouveau houses that exist between two of the biggest green park spaces anywhere in metropolitan areas in the Czech Republic certainly gives the place another very strong aspect to its character. Because you live with the fact that you have the choice of either of these wonderful, excellent, beautiful parks as part of your urban space. And it also influences the mentality of the people here to think more environmentally and ecologically and to adopt a green mentality also politically, because this neighborhood has by far the largest percentage of Green Party voters anywhere in the country.
How long have you yourself been living here, and how has it changed in that time?
I've lived in Letná and environs for probably the last 16 years or so. In that time, the neighborhood has moved in a way that's much more upscale but also more livable. I think there's a very nice multiculturalism. It's got a fairly well integrated Vietnamese community here compared to other parts of town. You see the Vietnamese guys out in the pubs and they're just part of the neighborhood, which I like very much. There's also a lot of specialized shops run by people from other EU countries, from Spain, from Italy, from France. And none of that was here when I first came here. The place really did have a character that was closer to that of Holešovice and to the rest of Prague 7. It was a bit grimy. It's not an industrial area in the way Holešovice or Karlín is, but it still felt you could feel the remnants of the former times much more strongly, and the darker elements of the history of this place were much more on display, let's say, and it's become more colorful and more livable, I would say, over that time.
Skateboards clack on concrete on part of Letná Plain, overlooking the Vltava, where an enormous, usually stationary metronome now stands. But the spot is best known as the site of a 15-metre high statue of Josef Stalin that was unveiled in 1955. The project took a great toll on its designer Otakar Švec, with the sculptor killing himself weeks before its completion. 7 years later, in 1962, the gigantic monument was destroyed. Keith Jones fills me in a bit more on its history.
The statue was only up for less than 2 years before Khrushchev denounced Stalin. Overnight, this thing was transformed from this pride and joy of the East Bloc communist world into an enormous embarrassment for the political authorities. And it was in that time that the sculptor Otakar Švec, who was actually a left-oriented avant-garde futurist of the 1930s generation, he was not a bad sculptor. The fact that his whole life story has collapsed into this awful episode is very traumatic, and it's symptomatic of the history of these kind of monuments in this country, that things are constantly erected, torn down, renamed, streets have their names changed. That's typical of this country in general. And of course in Letná we have that as well. Many places have changed their names, things come and go. This park is actually interesting where we are. It's halfway between two World's Fair pavilions, which I don't know of any other park in Europe that can boast that. That the 1958 Czechoslovak pavilion from Brussels is just below us, and the Hanovský pavilion, which was part of the 1891 global exhibition here, still stands as well. For me, what's also interesting, this place is not only the site of that former Stalin monument which was destroyed, but also what took place here was the largest, to this day, the largest and best attended contemporary art action and exhibition that was ever held in the Czech lands, which was the Totalitní Zóna project of 1990 and 1991, which was the major thing that was happening in alternative culture when I first came to this country, and out of which came things like Radio Jedna, the first private radio station.
Weren't they based here at the beginning?
Radio Jedna was based here. It started here.
And it was called Radio Stalin?
It was called Radio Stalin in its original. It started broadcasting in October 1990, at which point it was a pirate radio station, but it was very quickly visited by Václav Havel, who granted them an interview on the premises just below where we're standing. I have footage of that. And from that point on, it became not a pirate radio station, but a private radio station. And in that magical atmosphere of the early 90s, those things were possible, and they changed literally overnight in some cases. Also what started here was the Roxy, which was started by the Linhartova Nadace. Some of the first kind of private video archives started here. The first installation of a public work by David Černý, even before the pink tank, was his skull that is still in there. The remnants of it are still in there. All of those things had an enormous influence on the development of alternative culture all through the 90s and early 2000s. So I think that particular event, taking place on the same physical premises as this former Stalin monument, reveals quite a lot about the complicated political history, not only of this country, but specifically of this neighbourhood.
Now, many years after the Stalin monument was removed, there is a metronome here. Was this donated by Havel? Is there a Havel connection to this metronome?
I think that that's basically some sort of urban legend. It was more that the metronome came to be seen as a symbol of the Havel era, the early Havel era, in terms of how he grandfathered such projects into being under his auspices and by tacitly supporting them.
But where did the metronome come from? Do you know who designed it?
Actually, the names of the artists are inscribed here. It was done by a design company. There are 3 artists. And the thing is designed to be as anonymous and collective as possible. As a tip of the hat to Otakar Švec, as we mentioned, his whole artistic career somehow is overshadowed by this one enormous mistake that he made, which in fact cost him his life. So there was a deliberate attempt in creating this to make the work of art stand above authorship.
From the site of the former Stalin monument, Keith Jones leads me back across Letná Plain to a colourful bar and restaurant with outdoor seating on Čechova, one of the nicest streets in the area and one I walked every day when I myself lived there around a decade ago.
We are now sitting in a very new bar cafe in Letná called Vegtral, which is a sort of sister restaurant of a long-standing Prague establishment Fractal, which is more of a bar but is very much crucial as a meeting point for locals and people who work in the neighborhood, and is a place that's been around for the better part of 15 years. This place, as a sort of vegetarian and fish restaurant and outdoor cafe started as a spin-off of that only a few months ago. So it's a very new place. But it's actually right around the corner from where I live, and it's a place that I basically come to almost every day. I know practically everybody who comes in here, as many people in Letná recognize each other at least by sight. We tend to end up also going to the same places, and inevitably you just sort of meet everybody. Everybody's a friend of a friend, at least. And this particular area we're in, these few handful of streets that we're in the midst of right now, are filled with these places with little outdoor cafe seating, lots of trees, and it's very typical of the original layout of the neighborhood.
What kind of people come here to this bar?
You know, it's mostly people who are living around in this neighborhood, in this handful of streets that we're sitting in. It's basically a beer garden which attracts primarily the locals.
I used to go to a place just beside here where there was a doorbell. It was a kind of games club.
Yeah, that place was called Pokrok, which was just there, and there was also Žluta Panorka. This area has gone through a huge evolution, almost revolution, in the last 10 years. From being a district of kind of very late night bars, as you said, where you had to ring a bell to get in, and places that were open till 5 in the morning with a lot of dogs and a lot of dope smoking. And the whole neighborhood has changed to the extent that now what you see are the special areas reserved for prams, playgrounds for children, roses planted in the little garden. Basically, the orientation of what these spaces are used for has evolved along with the people who live in the neighborhood. But I remember all of those places well. Also, when I first moved to the neighborhood, they were all notorious.
Also, what's very near here, maybe 5 minutes walk from here, is one of Prague's best-known beer gardens, possibly with the best view of any beer garden in Prague.
Well, sure. The Letná beer garden is an exceptional place by any standards, and that's something that anybody who's visiting Prague is encouraged to visit, not just for the view, but for the atmosphere that it has as a traditional beer garden. It's a place that really has also preserved its sort of early 20th century character against the odds, and it really does reflect that Art Nouveau history of the whole neighborhood in a way that's very honest and unique. And the view is impeccable. I don't know of any beer garden anywhere in Europe that has such a perfect, outstanding panoramic view that you can enjoy also with the best beer in the world.
But you were telling me you don't bother going there so often anymore.
You know, I don't go there as much as I used to. I still obviously take any out-of-town visitors there, and they're all stunned by it. And it's a place I walk past on my walk into the center of town regularly, several times a week. But I'm very much at home in these little places in my few streets, like where we're sitting now. And I can get all the atmosphere and all the Prague characteristics that I need within my own life without going there. I'm used to that view. It never fails to impress me. I've never gotten tired of it. But I'm just as happy on a daily basis to see this view and to meet with all my friends here in Vegtra.
That was Keith Jones, who took Ian Willoughby around his favorite Prague haunts.